Hello again. There was a time when a government in Britain breaking a manifesto pledge would have been very serious news, but we're rather getting used to it these days. The reason it's such a serious matter is that we vote in a government based upon what they promised to do in a manifesto published before a general election. In essence, a party is saying to the voters, if you let us form the next administration, then we promise we will do these things. If you get voted in and don't keep those promises, then you've got into government under false pretences. It's a fraud. This is important because disregarding your manifesto pledges in this way serves to cheapen politics generally and weaken trust in the democratic process. I happen to be a fan of democracy, and anything which weakens it or brings it into disrepute is for me a very bad thing indeed. In September, the first of the manifesto promises was ditched. This was the rise in national insurance contributions. The manifesto had promised specifically that this would not happen. Then there was the promise that old age pensions would be increased every year by either the rate of inflation or average earnings or 2.5%, whichever was the highest. As wages rose quite sharply last year, that manifesto pledge was quickly dumped as well. Also in the election manifesto was this commitment that the government would continue to exceed the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP, that's gross domestic product, on defence, and increase the budget by at least 0.5% above inflation every year of the new parliament. In other words, since inflation this year is likely to be at least 9.5%, the manifesto pledges that defence spending will rise by 10% or so. Nothing doing. This is too expensive. So that's the third manifesto pledge ditched in less than a year. The supposed rationale for this string of broken promises is that the Conservatives could not have foreseen the COVID pandemic, and this has thrown finances into chaos. But that's a really feeble excuse. In the first place, there's no point in making such promises to begin with if you're going to drop them if things change a few months after you've won the election. The second point is, of course, that nobody forced the government to adopt such insane policies as making everybody stay at home for months without working and then printing extra money to pay for the wages while they were not working. It must surely have been obvious that this would cause galloping inflation, and I really don't see why we should pay for the recklessness of these schemes. I give a link to a news item about the latest broken promise in the description to this video. What has happened in effect is that during the COVID business, the government chose to pursue completely mad policies which were certain to create terrible inflation and ruin the economy. We've barely begun to feel the effects of this yet, but the signs are that this is all going to be exceedingly grim. The train strike we saw a few days ago was caused by a pay rise, which was wanted in response to the inflation and the cost of living crisis. Both of these things were a direct result of government policies, these same policies which have now allowed them to break those manifesto pledges. The teachers and doctors will be striking soon, along with barristers and the Lord knows who else. Those strikes are also a direct result of the government policies during COVID. They spent money wildly, caused inflation, which means that people are finding it hard to make ends meet, and they therefore want a rise in their wages and are prepared to go on strike to get it. The response to COVID in this country was so mad, as many people said at the time, and we are going to be paying for the government actions for decades to come. We're now starting to feel the real disaster of COVID which is not limited to old and ill people dying a few months earlier than they would otherwise have done, but rather every single person in the country finding it a struggle to get by financially. Wait until the winter and we'll see people freezing to death because they cannot afford both food and heating. Never has any British government I can remember made such a terrible mess of running the country.